record this. Here we go. So yeah, I wanted to, as we're recording this now officially, I wanted to host a little chat about this word that's been floating around, especially in consciousness culture circles and the integral circles that I frequent, especially on Twitter. It's called sense making. And I asked Twitter, so I put a call out for like what this means, and I received a lot of interesting responses to the actual definition of the word. And let me actually get my screen share on so I can share with you guys like some of the interesting responses. And I wanted to hear from everybody here as well, and anybody listening to this recording, how they make sense of the word sense making and if that applies to what they do. I found it to be a helpful word in putting a description down for what we do as integralists, as practitioners who are basically trying to navigate both the breakdown of particular value systems and orientations towards the world, systems, etc., economic, social, religious, and then the rearticulation of these systems. And we're going through, as many people talk about, a kind of a bifurcation right now where a lot of the basic structural foundations of this society are undergoing some kind of transformation, some kind of breakdown, and certainly a crisis, whether it's the climate crisis or the ecological crisis or the economic one, and they're all integrally related. So sense making in this sort of broad general term, at least what I get from the folks responding here, has to do with getting a sense of the whole again and feeling like we have our footing again in a time of flux and transformation and transition. And actually, you know, to some degree, getting comfortable in that liminal space, getting comfortable with it being processual and not necessarily fixed, not necessarily something that's resting that we can rest on, but something that is in movement. And to some degree, I think this is what the response has been, but I think the word itself, and Adam Robert, who's the editor of the Side View, he was mentioning that sense making has a origin with consciousness studies with like Varela and Thompson, et cetera. And it has to do with how an organism develops the sense of itself, how it navigates the world, how it perceives the world and integrates perception and is therefore able to thrive and survive. And in some sense, like that is really what we're doing culturally right now as integralists. So he was mentioning this too, that it scales. He was talking about Schmachtenberger and everybody else, how sense making or a sense of sense, it means much the same thing as he says here. You know, general theories of perception that are on the individual level, even as at organismic level, kind of translate into these sort of macro perspectives too. So I like that. I thought that was interesting. And then, of course, Matt, you're here. Matt was in this thread, too, and he mentioned the Gebserian point of view, right? Awareness, or Gebser would say wearing, right? And I wanted to get into this. I'm going to circle back to it, too, because as Matt's saying, awareness and the intensification of awareness, to me, and clearly to Matt, has a tremendous aspect in this idea of sense-making, right? Because as we were talking about it, even how Gebser opens the ever-present origin, is this idea that, okay, well, we're in a crisis, we're in a breakdown, and he has that quip, right, that only somebody in the midst of a transition would bemoan the end of their society. So that's a sense-making kind of statement, right? We're like, how do we transition into a new ontology and a new world orientation? But part of this, and I think this is the interesting thing that Integral brings to this, is sense making has to do not only with the new, right, the orientation of the new integral perception, this integral perception of time and space that Gebser talks about, but it also has to do with the integration of all of our forms of being in the world, right? We have these different structures of consciousness that constitute the integral human being. It's a sort of innate integrality that we all have. So sense making in the integral definition would have to do with some kind of process whereby these other structures are healed and reintegrated and processed and brought to the forefront again. and not just, okay, what do we do about modern industrial capitalism, right? How do we have a new myth? How do we have a new value system? It's not just that. It really kind of goes back and folds back into this question of what it means to be human. That, to me, is a closer definition to what sort of an integral sense making could be. Yeah, so there's quite a few other interesting things here. One is this guy, Ecological Criminal, was mentioning imaginative generalizations to theorize, make sense of, observe phenomena. And this triggered two thoughts. Imaginative generalizations, imagination. I really do feel that imagination, and particularly the artists, as we've talked about in the Gebser class and elsewhere, that art and aesthetics and creativity have so much to do with helping the individual learn what sense making is for their culture, for their structure of consciousness, that art and aesthetics connect intimately with sense making. So yeah, I know they're talking about theories in this little statement, imaginative generalizations. So it might sound more like they're talking about map making or theories of everything, to kind of go, what's the big picture? That's an aspect of imagination too, but I'm taking it to be a much more ontological imagination. So like, what's possible, right? How am I in the world with other beings? How do I imagine other beings? How do I relate to them? How do I relate to myself, right? I was just reading for the upcoming podcast, The Secret History of Christianity with Mark Vernon. And it's about Owen Barfield, very interesting, semi-contemporary of Gebser. He lived much later. He lived, I think, into the 90s, but he was an inkling and he was friends with C.S. Lewis and Tolkien. And one of the things that Vernon mentions that Barfield talks about is how the word theory used to mean something more like how your sight and your perception can kind of undergo a transformation. It's not just an abstract conceptual thing that's in your head. Theory had to do with seeing and literally perceiving things with the eye. So even though it's sort of a perspectival thing, it was still linked more consciously to this embodied act, right? So when we talk about theory, I wonder if we can also sort of ground it in this and sort of bring it back to this embodied orientation. And especially when we talk about imaginative generalizations, right? We think of abstract thinking and systems and complexity sciences, and all of those things can help. And I'm not saying that abstracting into those things isn't a part of this sense-making process. It's just that, the way in which we talk about theory and imagination and generalization has to be a little bit more integrally linked to the body, to perception, to phenomenology. And this is one of the reasons why, of course, I love Gebser's work and how it naturally always brings us back to that. So yeah, I don't want to just keep going down the list necessarily. But that was sort of my point, right? Because we can move from map making and system making and develop these kind of theories of the evolution of consciousness. But when it comes down to it, to me, those are only, halfway houses towards really trying to embody sense making in the present and work with the fundamental experience of being in the modern world, which is, I always go back to William Gibson, right? It's this feeling of being in a howling wind tunnel. This is very appropriate because the hurricane just missed us here in Florida. But there's this sense of kind of bearing down and holding on as things are rushing forward, and there really isn't a good sense that anybody has about where we're going. And there's also this anxiety about, how much momentum we've built up towards that event horizon that we're not really sure of, that we're not really understanding in terms of how we got there or where we're headed, or if it's going to be a good future. And for the most part, most people feel like where we're headed is some kind of crisis or collapse. So I think a lot of sense making has to do with exploring these sort of baseline experiences of being in the modern world, our perceptions of time, and really kind of getting down to those fundamentals. And in that, and doing so, like seeing through them, right? Like not being fixated on them anymore. You know, I feel like there's a liberational quality in working with the structures of consciousness, working with the dynamics in ourselves, and then seeing how that's also playing out in the world. It's not that those things necessarily are going to go away as problems. It's just that as actors, right, as creators, doing this practice of so-called sense making, integrally speaking, can free up so much energy, I think, individually for us, and then also as a community, to really put our momentum and our energy into other things that would be more helpful right now, rather than kind of reiterating some of the same problems, right? Gebser talked about this as like a kind of clarifying what the new is and the new statement. And that has to do with a new fundamental orientation towards the world, a new phenomenology. So clarifying what that is and then leaning into that, I think this might be one of the strengths of an integral community that builds these containers of practice, right? And then also builds these, I guess not exactly containers, but as collaborators, then publishing and articulating what the new is, and then leaning into it and energizing it, right? So, at any rate, I don't want to keep going at the moment, so let me open it up and see, Edith, if you want to mention anything, and then I'll get to Matt's comments too.
Yeah, actually I do. I just want to just briefly mention my experience of listening to him. And I felt the way he was speaking at first, I could just feel that whole mental, the whole constriction of trying to make sense, and, the talking of the information, and his quote, running faster, running blind. I could just really feel that. And I thought, whoa, this feels so mental to me. And, speaking about perspectives, and just the quickness with which his mind was working, and he, towards the end, he slowed down and he brought in vulnerability and some of those things. What I really like is what Matt said in his comment, was that there's this, that it's also more about awareing. And because I think that helps relax. Otherwise you can just get so caught up in this, well, what's true, what isn't true, how do I do the research, and I'm never going to find the way. But I think when you step into awareing, it just feels like a different world. I mean, all those things are still there. I think it's just much easier to cope personally, and also maybe to see a way through. So that was just my sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's spot on. Just in terms of our individual and also, I guess, localized social capacity to assist in some way, I don't think will necessarily be as helpful if we don't have that baseline of awareness. And if we take, like, reading Gebser for me, or reading a lot of these like theorists on the evolution of consciousness, the ones that ring the most true and the most helpful for me are the ones that kind of, it's not really a conceptual thing as much as it's almost like a poetic attitude that you kind of get, and then you can kind of feel beyond certainty and uncertainty. There's just this kind of truth about it. There's this quality of yes, that's true. There's an insight in this, and then you can kind of see how that poetic insight is manifesting in the world. And this is what I think, it perhaps is the dangerous thing about being transdisciplinary. It's a lot of the times it's not just pattern recognition. It's this kind of poetic sensibility that you grok with, okay, here's this new attitude, here's this new style that's emerging. And I don't really think it's easy for us to tune into that if we're in this kind of state of feeling closed down and anxious and disoriented. we need to have these spaces to be able to relax, to settle into the present, and then listen to the present, and then allow those other, I don't know what you would call this, like your poetic faculty of mind and presence, right? It's a very embodied feeling of sort of being with something, with your whole being, or some part of your being identifies with this sort of almost invisible tracer of meaning, and you get it, right? And I think a lot of people in the integral community feel that towards the evolution of consciousness, etc. So what's helpful for me anyway is yes, getting that sense of clarity, of spaciousness, of opening up, and then leaning in and attuning to this kind of poetic insight, which applies to all of the structures, you know, the magic, mythic, mental, archaic, integral. It's just getting those as almost feeling tones, poetic feeling tones, and then allowing them to kind of inform and integrate within you, not something that you're consciously like a puzzle box putting together, right? It's sort of allowing that openness to generate this process. And a lot of that is like trust. It's kind of like an allowing, right? And then when you have that, the participation comes in, I think anyway, with at least with the scholars and the artists, is this, okay, how do I express this? How do I share it? How do I point it out? It depends on what we're doing, what our role is in society. It may be a given profession, but then we can kind of turn it back around and offer it, you know, and then learn about it through that offering. And I've certainly learned that from trying to teach these Gepser courses or talk about all of this. And I've certainly learned a lot from our community. So there's this kind of constant opening, presencing, and allowing for that integration to kind of consolidate. And I think, you know, in a sense, it's almost kind of autopoetic in that, you know, it sort of coalesces of itself and we're participating in it, but it's not necessarily something we're directing, you know, in a very kind of mental way. So anyway, I don't know where I'm going with this other than the fact that I think this sort of sense making and integrating and then building these containers for it, there's this, and I will always triumph the poetic, like there is a poetic sensibility behind it that people are just going to have to get comfortable with for once, and not worry about it being, you know, what's the theory? How does it fit together?
Yeah, and if I could just say something, and I think we might always feel this pulling us back of this, like it's so much in our DNA to be to play the zero sum game,
Mm-hmm.
and to, because that's the comfortable place, and we do it in so many. I just loved how he talked about all the different ways that, you know, that we do that.
Mm-hmm.
And I really resonated with that because I used to be in marketing and I was really, really good at it. And for all the reasons, you know, that he mentioned, it was like, yes, I know I did all those things and I just don't want to do them anymore. But still, even with promoting a cause, let's say an integral culture or whatever, there's still that tendency to want to go into that, well, this is better and this is, you know, it's just so deep in the DNA. So to move into this sense making in a different way, it's still, it feels like, yes, I'm moving forward, but this is wanting to pull me back here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
I could also.
Oh, hey, Matt.
I wouldn't mind mentioning something too, listening to what both of you are saying.
Sure.
Is so with the poetic thing, you know, one thing I thought a lot about is like the I guess you would say multi-dimensionality of language, you know, because like I'll like, for me personally, with the whole sense making thing, one thing I would relate it to is kind of the process of me like coming to illustrate something on my own. And, you know, one thing I've noticed is, and I guess I do kind of relate them to the structures, is, you know, I'll go through a bodily experience, which is present throughout, but like the, you know, I was also reading the thing about the numinous as well, and how, like at first, like it's very numinous and the bodily experience, you know, reveals itself. And at the time, because it kind of makes itself present, you know, you don't really know, it's not like a conscious act. Or at least it's not like a mental conscious experience. And so in that one moment, you're kind of experiencing like the presence of something that wasn't from your consciousness, that's, or at least from your like mental consciousness, that's revealing itself. And then through that process, I personally like go through this weird process where I really resonated with what Getter said about how like early mythic men like interacted with spirits or like gods as if they were like nameless gods. And then as they kind of went down the wire, they started giving them names and they started personifying them, and it kind of like slowly churned its way into like definitions and symbols and things like that, and really isolating it. And I kind of feel like that's kind of how I interact with things that don't make sense at first, or things, or even just things that stay irrational, and I'm kind of like gleaning a little from them.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'll go through that process, but I've also noticed at the same time, because I have a habit of like conveying things poetically, because it's just I don't have like a talent for formulating it and going through like a real hard like studying of what it is I'm experiencing and really laying it down in some like cold way.
Mm-hmm.
I've noticed that people have see, the thing I'm interested in is how do you, because I'll get through that point where like I'll experience it, and I'm trying to, I guess to some degree, render it visible consciously, even though like just, I would say, just experiencing the manifestation of the unknown like that, it is to some degree rendering it visible, because you're kind of consciously like seeing it occur in front of you. Is how do you presentate that without people like getting crazy about it seeming like you're just like within abstraction? Like how do you presentate what you have a sense of without it seeming like you're too caught up in like because my question is, what does abstraction necessarily mean? Is it like just because I noticed that one gentleman that was talking to, I think his name was Adam, and he was kind of accusing, I guess, the sense making community to being too wrapped up in abstraction. And it's, my wonder is, well, how do you progress the conversation and maybe, I guess, reconcile people's fear or issue with people seeming like they're caught up in abstraction? How do you get around that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So that's something actually I've wrestled with too in listening to myself talk, and then listening to like folks like Schmachtenberger, who I really like. On the one hand, I have these moments of clarity listening to him in the video example. And if you missed the video, it'll be in the Salon call notes. On the other hand, I do perceive sometimes how it can be seen as, just sort of playing with this wonderful and complex model about systems and the individual and the society and complex systems and how they change and how they transform and all these little factors that he's playing with. So like on the one hand, yes, it appears to be very abstract. On the other hand, maybe there are other ways to do it. Maybe my only tentative critique of the sense making folks online, and it's not really one, because I have the same criticism myself, using evolution of consciousness theories and talking about philosophy, right? Like it can go very abstract. I sense with folks like Schmachtenberger that it's not necessarily an abstraction that he's coming from. Like he gets the whole. There's this like intuitive sense that he groks generally the whole thing going on, all the processes, and it's not an intellectual thing that he's starting from. And this is just my interpretation of him, and like this is my reading of him, my sense of him. And there's this attitude a lot of these folks have that is naturally drawn towards kind of using systems theory and abstraction, etc., because it's one of the few languages that we have to talk about this new sensibility, this new attitude that a lot of us feel, and a lot of us express it not necessarily as baroquely or as complexly as Schmachtenberger does, but we express it in meme culture, or we express it in just a general sense of like the kind of the panic that we have right now about climate change and ecological crisis and post-capitalism. It's just this sort of environment. It's in the air, right? And I think the sense-making culture and communities are generally one group of people who've tried to internalize that new attitude that's sort of permeating everything and articulate it using the tools they have at hand. They're not perfect tools, but I think they're a good place to start. And I think it's also useful and maybe even a good, like, kind of like a pushback for them. Maybe this is something that I can bring up and you can bring up in further conversations with them, is how do we continue to try to express this in ways that aren't necessarily using those same tools? Because I don't think that's where they're coming from. They're coming from this much more intuitive sense, whether they call it that or not. The language and the map making and their particular dispositions for those maps might be very abstract sounding, but I don't think anybody necessarily is coming from that alone. Even like this is what we learned from Gepser, right? Like the mental structure and the perspectival world is at its basis a kind of a poetic attitude, right? It's a kind of a disposition, a way of being in the world, whether or not the person who's utilizing and implementing this very spatialized form of thinking is aware of it. They're coming from this new sense. And so I think for us, it's like really helpful to kind of point that out and kind of see through it, and bring it back to that and trace it back and follow it back. And then continuously ask, like, okay, how do we articulate this in another way? Are there other ways? Because if it's an attitude rather than a particular map or system thinking designed expression, then the attitude is what you'll pick up on elsewhere. And maybe you will find better examples there. You know what I mean? So it's not really a direct answer, but I think that's just the sense I get where a lot of them are coming from. But I do understand the tension with that.
With that, so with your question, like, is there a way to convey it beyond this? And one thing I've noticed is like, and maybe it's not appropriate, but I kind of see Twitter and like social media kind of as like the domain for like, I guess, abstraction, because you can't really show someone like why it is you've come to a thought or something like that. Like the way I kind of see it is like, like talking the way we do is one form of conveyance, but I would also say like, just acting out in the world and participating with the world beyond just speaking, that I do think that in that sense that also conveys, and that is a type of language. And just like how painting and illustrating, I do see that as a type of language. And I do think that they all do convey. I guess partially the question is, whether or not someone's willing to listen to each form of language, whether someone's willing to look at a piece of myth or art and listen to it and not necessarily reject it because it seems like ridiculous or something like that.
Yeah. And that's kind of an interesting, how do you call it? It's an interesting place for us to be in if we want to build these containers to help, like, because here we have people with possibly the same new attitude or orientation. And then also we have this translation gap where they may not actually listen to each other because they have very different styles of communicating and orientations, but they still have that underlying attitude. So it's like for an integral practitioner who's trying to bridge that gap between people, who, like, you put two people in a room, you got one person who's like an artist and the other who's like a systems thinker. It'd be interesting this is sort of our challenge, I think, is how to finding ways of them communicating with one another, and actually kind of grokking that underlying insight, or finding a place to share some kind of mutuality. And I think that's a larger problem though with like Twitter and social media right now, right? It's there's this segmentation and hyperfragmentation. It's very easy to kind of go like, okay, this is my first reaction with the sense-making community, just bumping into them online and then having this whole subset of new language to try to figure out from them and go, what are these guys talking about? Are they saying the same thing I am? I don't really know. I feel like I'm at the wrong party. But then slowly kind of learning to translate, like, okay, they're doing something similar. And I think that translative work is, easier said than done. But anyway, yeah, like these are great, really good comments, Matt. Thank you.
Yeah, if I could just say something, I
Mhm.
think that what you both have said about the attitude, leaning into the attitude or feeling into it, is so very important. Like I was ready to not listen to that video because it just seemed so mental to me, but there was something that kept me in it. Uh, uh, and I could feel a little bit of the attitude coming through, more so towards the end. Um, but at first, it kind of like it looked like gymnastics, uh, and I thought, do I really want to be here at this party? But I stayed with it, and I think you're really right about becoming those translators, and how do we? I think that's a really key question, and it's something that I really struggle with because we can feel the attitude, and we know we just feel that we're on the same in the same wavelength, and yet then the next step comes in making the language different, or I'm not sure if it's just the language or and also the how we express it.
Mhm.
And I know, Jeremy, you talk about this poetic way, and I think we need some lessons on how to actually do some of these things.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, I agree. On the one hand, I think it'll just come with experience. Like building some containers and bringing in the right people who kind of are good with this sort of intersubjective practices, with these in mind. I really would like to collaborate with people about this question, because I don't know if I necessarily have the particular expertise for that. But on the other hand, um, I think a lot of it has to do with just connecting personally with individuals who are coming from one area or another and engaging with them and trying to do that work ourselves, just in terms of finding ways to say, like, what you're saying and what I'm saying, they're both about this unnameable thing, right? And it's easier said than done, because I've, like, for instance, recently I was on the Michael Brooks show, and I love those guys. They're really, really funny, and they have the right attitude. Especially Michael. He's talking about building these planetary meshworks. He has a background with integral theory, and yet he's also in this very secular, political, left-oriented world space that's all about post-capitalism, and they're kind of highly literate with everything going on in all of the world about socialism, about democracy, et cetera. And they know the ins and the outs of all of these historical processes. And I think behind their attitude is this new sense of, like, we need to build a new way of being in the world. Like, the whole neoliberal economic approach is not working, et cetera. So their focus is a lot on democracy and economics, but their sub focus or unconscious focus is this kind of integral, a perspectival world of networks and meshworks, and um, just sort of the removal of the centralization of power, and are experimenting with new social systems. So they're talking about it too, but they have this whole other language. And what's difficult, I think, when it comes to these things is, especially when it gets very heated, that community and that culture, as one example, is very vehemently, like, hostile against any kind of spirituality, right? Any kind of, like, generalist thinking, any big picture thinking, even though they themselves, I think, are practicing a kind of a big picture thinking. So it's very difficult territory to navigate, and without getting shut down or shut out. Um, and so it's not easy. It's definitely not easy. But again, I think the role of, and this is what I'm going to be launching this next week, the role, I think, of art in this is, I think sometimes the practices and the methods can be learned from uh, the poetic sensibilities that are naturally cropping up in our culture, and why particular ones are successful at doing one thing or another. I think, like, for instance, Jeff Vandermeer's work in helping to articulate and even get under your skin to understand this new kind of aperspectival self of, between nature and culture, between civilization and post-civilization, between the human being and the non-human being. I think that as a work of art, he's an artist, he's a literary guy. He was able to come up with this just with his particular creative sensibility. And there's a lot to learn from what he did in his books, I think, in terms of that, just you undergoing this experience of reading it. So I think it almost requires a tremendous, studiousness with finding and identifying and finding why particular things are helpful in the arts, especially, and trying to, and you don't want to like essentialize it and then go, okay, here's the new rule book, right? Here are the 5 things Jeff Vandermeer did to help create this new aperspectival sense of self in you, and you could just apply that to your art. Like, obviously it's not that simple or reductive, but I do think just identifying them in the same way that Gebser did, just like identify where it's showing up and why it's working, and trying to learn from that yourself, and yes, it ends up in a theory book, it ends up in a philosophy book, but then it also can translate, because in Gebser's own time, it translates with artists taking a philosophical book and making it into art. And that's actually another aspect of what Vandermeer did. At the end of the trilogy, he mentioned he was reading Tim Morton's Dark Ecology, and what is it called? It was like a post-Occupy book, The Coming Insurrection. It was this like collectivist publication from a left-leaning media press, and it's just sort of about revolution after Occupy. And he was reading the two in a very and the book that he produced out of this inspiration is profoundly poetic and weird and mystical and sublime and organic, and it doesn't really sound like it's coming from any kind of heady theory thing. So I don't know if that's a direct answer, but I feel like these are the areas I'm interested in to answer that question, kind of drawing from art and trying to understand what that new art is doing that's so successful.
With what you said too, one thing I think I've heard you say it as well too, like the concept of trust is I think I've heard you say probably at least once is, I guess in integral communities there's like an ongoing question of how do you identify integrality when you see it, or how do you identify integral structure when you see it. And I definitely think that for me personally, I kind of identify that obsession as like an obsession with like the right and direction and things like that. And if it's true that every human out there has the whole structure within them, one of those things I would say is if you truly feel like you have a sense of things and you're kind of conveying it to the world, in any manner that you can, I definitely think as future generations crop up, I definitely think that like as people tap into integrality and kind of render it visible, I can definitely see how like the presence of that new will strike a chord throughout throughout the human in future generations, where like I guess you could say like our society as it's been, strikes a mental chord, strikes a perspectival chord, and I think that as time goes on, and and if we are truly in that liminal space where we are transitioning into a more like rendered visible world, I definitely think that future generations, the way we presentate that to them, I think it'll naturally strike a chord in them. And it doesn't necessarily have to just strike a chord in them in the mental domain where they have to just constantly obsess over assessing whether or not what they're feeling is right or true, but it'll just kind of like when you like you say, like when you when something strikes you as true, it's hard to really like wrestle with it unless you're like really really obsessed with things being like, I guess you would say like formulaic and like super perspectively clear in like an eye sense kind of way. And also with what you said about maybe like integrality, like our participations, maybe they'll pop up in a philosophy book or in a different kind of book. I also think that they'll pop up in like just the human attitude out in the world, and in the things that we do, and in the things that we say, and in the ways that we think, and the emotions that we display. I think that it'll kind of prop up everywhere.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Exactly. The term transdisciplinary is too reductive even of a term to describe what Gebser and a lot of other integral theorists are really kind of pointing at, which is it's not something that's just arising in bodies of literature. It's arising in human bodies, in human beings, in our social spaces. And it might manifest in particular everyday little ways. It might manifest in general, in the negative as kind of a general like social anxiety. But if you ask what that anxiety is about, there's this sense that things are changing. There's this sense that like the world that we had is no longer, a foundation is no longer available for us. So the everyday human being and their attitude is changing. And I think we can identify this, and we can identify the negative and the positive reactions as well, and everything in between, in terms of how we're responding to that crisis as human beings. And that's what I liked, at least theoretically, what Bruno Latour was doing in his book Down to Earth, where he was basically saying, neoliberalism and Trumpism and this whole kind of ethno-national resurgence is a response to the new. Actually, it's a response to the world of the perspectival. Essentially, he's not using that word, but shutting down and no longer existing anymore. And so there's this kind of flight from the new in all of these different ways, whether it's neoliberalism or if it's the alt-right and the new right. There's this kind of attempt to escape into this an imaginary perspectival horizon of the past where things were better. Whereas, the challenge is coming back down to earth and coming back down to a shared reality. So in the same sense, what you're saying here is that it's going to be in everyday people. It's going to be everywhere. And I think this is also where the answer is. It's like, as he says, basically the meaning of down to earth is to come back down to the terrestrial, to the shared co-inhabited environments, to the, as Donna Haraway says, the sympoiesis, right? The co-inhabited spaces that we're generating together as different organisms, human and non-human. How are we going to live in this space together? We're not going to be able to do this by telling everybody to move up through a developmental map. People are going to be where they're going to be. So the question is much more fundamental and much more almost biospheric. And how do we come back down to earth and share a space with people who are going to be in different value systems, right? What is not necessarily the universal, but what is the habitat? What is the co-living? What does the symbiosis look like of the whole coming together? And this is the challenge. It's like it's moving into the concrete, And so like in terms of practicality and looking for this, I mean, where are the social spaces right now that are working on that, right? Like what are we doing to create new places to live together, to dwell together? And that is the response to that question is so systemic, right? It's people experimenting with new economic models. It's the giant macro crisis of late stage capitalism and the ecological crisis it's induced with global warming and climate change. It's the immediate governmental logistics of like voting and democracy and using a legal system that was born, basically late Middle Ages, early Renaissance, right? A print age government structure. So they're systemically, structurally, and then also coming down to just feeding people, like eating food and sharing food and living with other organisms. Like all of these things are being, I wouldn't say they're being addressed, but we're being forced to address them. I think we're being forced to confront this. And the world in which it's efficient to have that mental abstraction and to kind of go, oh no, globalization is this advancement towards bigger capital and open borders and open economic systems where everybody has these world banks and we all share this, and this is the globalized society that we're headed towards, up and out, right? We're moving beyond ethnocentrism into modernism, into globalism. That trajectory, that arrow is unreal as, that perspectival cutting away of the whole, right? You only see this totalized this totalized vision of the whole, which is not actually the macro, it's just an abstract. Globalization is that, right? So the question is, how do we build the real planetary? How do we grow the real planetary? It's not in this trajectory that we've been doing for the past few hundred years. That's folding away. Anyway, so I kind of started abstracting from your initial comment there, but I think you're totally right, Matt, that it's going to show up in everyday lived lives. And I think everyone is anxious about it too at the same time. Like, I think you can reach people about that. Now, how does that translate into policy work? And like, if we were an integral think tank, like I know we have those, I know those exist in the integral community. Like, what do we say? How do we do this? Is it really just about like navigating different value memes, conservative and progressive? Or is it really a whole other orientation about, living together, coming back down to earth? So anyway, any thoughts about any of this, or something completely different?
Well, one thing I was thinking too, while you were saying that, is with the whole like it propping up everywhere, and again, for some reason I find that such a good term. Like you'll find it in a philosophy book, is it. And I don't know if you would consider it, but it seems like you kind of do. If you would consider like the cinema as like a mythological domain, like the cave, and you're kind of interacting with it, it is interesting that even in like if you find it in a philosophical book where, the writing and everything kind of conveys itself in like a mental way, the fact that you can see movies like Interstellar and Akira and those kind of movies that try to also glean integrality in a mythical domain, it's kind of interesting how in like conscious structure like domains, you see integrality itself become present in those domains as well. Like it'd be interesting if like virtual reality and games also start conveying integrality, and that starts propping up in like more participatory things like games. But like if you can see like integrality in discussion, and you can see integrality in action, integrality in movies, and movies are very population enriched environments. Not everyone will read a book, but a whole lot more people will go watch a movie. A whole lot more people will like listen to music. I wonder if there's like I guess you could argue that technically everything to some degree like reflects the whole, but if we're talking about specifically like presentating the new, I wonder where you would identify those in places outside of like cinema and books, and like see them in things maybe like in music.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't. Music is definitely outside of my particular purview, but generally speaking, just all electronic music, all digital music, I think is expressing. So when we talk about integrality, right, and we're talking about concretizations of it in technology and our communication mediums, that kind of spills into media studies and McLuhan. So I think just in terms of the ability to have digital art and digital music to be able to sample different historical periods and put them together, right? The whole like vaporwave and nostalgia is an interesting kind of temporal music. They're all in the same way that print can help generate and consolidate the perspectival world. I think digital art, digital media has helped, generally speaking, as like an ecology and an atmosphere that people are growing up and producing art in and creating in, is helping to generate integral style thinking and perception. And this is not necessarily saying that like, digital music is a good place to just like become integral or something. It's like, this is one of those sort of background radiation, cosmic radiation of integrality that's sort of going on, right? There's a new style in which cutting up time and cutting up music and then sampling it, recombining it in creative ways, which goes beyond just slicing it up. That sort of emergence out of the deconstruction is very interesting. I always brought up Pogo like 10 years ago. There's so many other artists, and just digital music in general does this. But again, remixing and sampling is very interesting, and I think is a very kind of an integral oriented art that even in Gebser's time he didn't have really many examples of in music. He had sort of like the avant-garde examples in music, but with digital art it's this whole other thing, where the past is able to come back into the present's able to resample the past, you know, and then you have this time play that's going on, and then also, you know, you're able to, out of deconstructing something into bits and pieces and putting it back together, creatively, the present is able to kind of leak through it, you know, in presence as in sort of an intensification. Like, I think cutting things up and then reorienting them and reproducing them in this new way, there's something untraceable or unnameable about a thing that you can actually allow to express itself. And I always talk about Pogo because of this. He like samples movies and he'll turn them into songs. And I think we used one example at one of our classes with the Gebser course, but I got the sense that he got the feeling of the whole movie. It's kind of like, it's like poetic attitude of the whole film, but he sampled it in such a way that like words didn't matter anymore, right? Like words as nouns. They were more of sounds. They were more of weird cut up method style expressions that seemed to somehow like get each of the characters in the film or something along those lines. So I think it's really interesting. And to me, it speaks to this new kind of creative attitude that we're playing with time. Time is becoming an art form. That's how I would sum it up with digital art. And you see that with like simple mimetic stuff too, right? Like where somebody will have like a picture of a World War II era city in the middle of Europe during World War II. You know, there's exploded buildings and soldiers marching, and then they'll Photoshop it with the contemporary street, and it'll be, you know, people grabbing a Starbucks coffee, and they'll just put that in one image, right? And this is such a mundane thing, but if you think about what it's doing there, it's sort of, it's playing with time, right? The presence of the past is showing up in this image in a very mundane way. But this is cliche. This is like, it's every day. Like posts like this, media like this are happening every single day. And the people who are producing this are not high professional artists. They're just kids who have, you know, the right program on their iPads or MacBooks or whatever. So I think, again, that these fundamental background radiation forms of media are slowly and gradually allowing us to play with our perception of time and space in a totally different way. And they're just growing up with it as if it was second nature. So I think that we can't underestimate how big of an impact digital media and digital art has had, just in a completely mundane sense that integralists don't even look at. You know, we look at the visionary art, but then like it's the remixing on YouTube and et cetera that actually has, you know, a massive impact on our forms of sense making, right? Does that make sense? Well, let me know.
Sorry.
Okay.
I was unmuting. No, it makes sense. So a word that comes to mind, because one thing I was thinking about while we were talking is I couldn't escape this word synthesis, but a word that I really like that I think you can find in like music like Pogo. And it's interesting because like when you listen to like a song like what Pogo makes, like technically as you play the song, it starts and it finishes. But like you say, you know, like some things keep repeating, and you know, like something you hear in the beginning will be produced at the end and stuff like that. And so there's at the same time, so it's like non-linearity is like gleaning through a linear domain where, you know, you start a song and the song ends. And even like with like the cinema, like when I think of like the construction of like the cinema environment where you like create the screen and set up the seats and create the projector, there's a lot of measuring and there's a lot of like technology, which I think is definitely like mental. But at the same time, it renders a mythical domain, and that mythical domain in the cinema can render the integral domain. I definitely like the word interpenetration, how like in like Pogo or something, like with like time forms, or like with that picture of like the present and the past being rendered present at the same time. It definitely seems like part of what you could say about integrality is a lot of things interpenetrate each other.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's also what Gebser is doing in all of his writing. We've talked about this as we read through Ever-Present Origin. His style is always interpenetrating or interdependent. Like he'll be talking about the magic, but he'll refer also to the mythic. He'll refer also to the mental. In each of these processes, even as he's focusing on one structure, there's all these sort of interdependent relations to all of the other structures and to integrality itself. And he can't, in some sense, it might be very deliberate, but in another sense, if you're really thinking about the structures as this whole interdependent being, then of course they're always interrelating with one another. And no matter any one situation you're looking at, the others are there having some part to play, some kind of relationality. So just, I agree with you. Like, it's not exactly, this might be a good example of what syneresis looks like that Gebser talks about. Like synthesis is, again, the abstract conceptual, but kind of putting it together. There's an element of that with this kind of music, but then also what arises and comes together is a very kind of nonlinear creative act with its own sort of order that we don't have much deliberation over, other than kind of as the artist kind of going, well, that little sound in that part of the film, I can hear that as a musical note, and I'm going to put it to another part of the film. And even though they're not in linear order of how they appear in the film, they have this new movement and this new expression that works perfectly in my art form, right? So I think that emergence that kind of arises out of cutting things up and then allowing them to coalesce together is very much this sort of syneresis. It's an example of that in art rather than in a theoretical work. It's a time play, and it's an expression of wholeness and interpenetration, as you say, without necessarily being very deliberately fused together, like a welder would, fuse together things for a machine. So yeah, I think that's definitely an element of it there. And like there's a temporix at work here too, because again, the cut up method was this very avant-garde thing. William S. Burroughs would talk about it before, way before the internet. And for him, there was also a magical element to this as well, in that when you break things down, everything becomes these interpenetrating points that are related to all other points. And as he says, when you cut into the present, the future leaks out. And I love that line from him, because he believed that when you sometimes would practice the cut up method, that's exactly what would happen, and the way the words would fall together. And he had this, he was, on the one hand, he's speaking of this in a much more kind of prescience or kind of anticipating the future, or like, oh, the cut up paragraph I wrote today, I put together today, there was a line in it and the thing happened tomorrow. I think he was meaning it in that kind of intuitive, magical sense. But I think we can also see this in a Gebserian sense, right? In an integral sense, that not necessarily when you cut into the present, although that is fine, it's not just cutting that he was doing, right? It was allowing these creative bits and pieces to coalesce together. And in the present, when he's doing that, something emerges, something temporally from the future emerges. So, yeah, I would look to that as well. And this is what I mean about the applicability of integral studies to so many other domains, in that, like, as a human being, we can kind of navigate these spaces and think about things going on in much more popular culture and art studies that might have relevance to what we're studying. But yeah, I don't know. Edith, any thoughts or reflections about that? Because I know you are a writer.
Well, I was just thinking about how much I really loved the book that you recommended, which was Meander Spiral Explode by Jane Allison. And because she shows ways of going beyond the linearity. And what I realized, I especially liked, and it reminded me of she talked about this one kind of writing as being, it was almost like cells in a beehive or something of that sort, where there's a part here and then a part, then she brings a part here. The author does this and this and this, and eventually you get a sense of the whole. But it's not linear, even though the book, the book has a beginning and the end. And what was really cool about that was that I realized that I write very much in that sort of a way. And I always thought, well, why can't I go on, forever and ever and do this long arc? And it was just felt so boring to me. And it was just like, okay, yeah, I found something that resonates with what I do naturally already. I'm just going to do more of it now.
Mhm.
And I can, it just felt so good to read that. And it was like, I think it was just a brilliant book, and probably that's why you recommended it. It's just like so full of possibilities about ways of going beyond the linearity, and showing them clearly.
Yes, I agree. I love that book, and Matt, if you haven't checked it out, I recommend it. Even I don't know if you are practicing writing it. There's so many great examples of literature to look at in that book of this style. And yeah, I think, again, here we are. If you just look into the arts, just kind of peel back the cover and look at what the artists are doing. And it's just so interesting that some of the people she mentions are not necessarily completely contemporary. They span many decades. So it's a style and a sensibility that, yeah, we're focusing on it, but we're actually kind of the integral, not to get too tribal, but the integral edge that I think is fun and seductive about what we're doing is that we're saying, like there's an energy and a sensibility that could be very helpful for the crisis of the present, and that I think people who began to think in that style, that could help us tremendously right now. And not only that, but it could help in the sense of coming back to the meaning of the word sense making and the desire for it and the lack of it. It fills that gap. It fulfills that aspect that we're looking for right now. And not that it's finished and static. It's to the contrary, it's very energizing and creative. It's like, okay, well, I see people doing this everywhere in the arts and in literature and in novels. So how can I get involved? What can I do in my own right, in my own way? And I think that's the most exciting thing. And also really the most needed thing. We need people who are completely on fire with this new sensibility and almost in a much more, aware way, possessed by it. And in the sense that the perspectival artists and scientists seem to be possessed by a new world and trying to articulate it in any way they could. I think we really need that right now. And I think that's actually what's happening in that book. It's just a good example of seeing it at play. And then identifying, like as a reader, like reading those stories and then also reading that book, Meander, Spiral, Explode. Thanks for posting it in the chat, Edith. And reading the stories and then identifying what's so interesting about those stories can kind of help you rewire yourself a bit. As you're saying, it kind of strengthens your own capacity to kind of do that in your own creative domain, wherever that is. And yeah, like Matt's mentioning, more and more enticed to read McLuhan. Yeah, it's so funny. Like McLuhan's always talking about this, that like the new electronic culture sensibility is simultaneity. It's not moving from one segment to the next segment to the next linear segment in this causal chain. It's funny because he says that kind of perspectival causation of A causes B causes C in that chain doesn't actually exist. He actually says, the real causality is this interdependence. That's the real efficacy. And that's the efficacy for us of the integral human being. McLuhan even used the word integral here and there. It's so funny. I recommend, oh my gosh. I mean, like you could start with the medium as the message. You could start with, oh gosh, what's it called? I'm looking at it right here. The Gutenberg Galaxy, or I have like a really old book that's falling apart. I'm drawing a blank at the moment for the title. Let's see. Understanding Media, the Extensions of Man. It's like the quintessential McLuhan, which is a shorter one. And I'm going to warn you, though, McLuhan is no easier than Gebser. Fortunately, he wrote in English, so there's no translation issues. But there is translation issues in terms of his style. It's very poetic. It's very literary minded, so you have to like kind of read through it. Very literate with Western canon stuff, Shakespeare, and all of the great artists and definitely James Joyce, and he's dropping all of these guys as he's talking about it. And again, there was no media theory, there was no media studies before McLuhan, as far as I'm aware. He was really one of the first, and he was coming from the humanities, and he was studying modern novels and James Joyce. So, and as he says, James Joyce is, for him, applied McLuhanism. So we're, in a sense, we're also doing that and talking about that right now. Like what is applied integrality? How do we see it showing up in our art and creations? And again, like back to integral, so sense making and integral cultures, not only I think is the role of integral cultures to help cultivate presence and wearing, right? Presentiation. But part of it, presentiation, is developing or cultivating these new sensibilities and attitudes in practitioners. And I don't want to say assembling or gathering or synthesizing a library of integral art, but being able to at least have the capacity to begin to read into the world where integrality is showing up. And so there is some sense of like an extended, not canon exactly, but hypertext, or as he says, as Gebser says, it's a method and an art. And so we're not just looking for a synthesis of here's what integrality is, here are your practices, and here's where it's showing up in the world. Here's the canon of what everything is integral. There's an openness. It should open us up while also being a kind of a container where we're really kind of fine-tuning those sensibilities to find them out in the world, right? And to develop them in our, not only in our own lives, but also in terms of whatever work we're doing. Like Edith and I are talking about art and literature and how to produce this in literature. So anyway, I could just keep rambling about that, but I recommend McLuhan for sure.
Yeah, I just want to say one thing here that I've been reflecting on, and that is that I think we each have our own, like our own specialties or things that we're really good at. And it can become a distraction almost to say, oh, well, how can I do it here? How can I do it there? But for myself anyway, if I think about through my writing, how can I do it through that? Because it's actually through writing that's been my main practice in my life. It's probably taught me more than, reading or doing various practice, but that practice of writing. So writing itself has become my teacher and also my path. And by feeling it showing up and seeing it and practicing it in that particular area, then it bleeds into other places. So that's how I'm going about it, is trying to understand how other people are doing it out here, but really asking what is mine to do in this way.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's also very helpful too, because it helps circumvent the natural attitude that we have about this, which is like, well, if I focus on where do I focus or where do I apply it? It's like, well, start with yourself. And then as we've been saying about this, like getting the poetic attitude, cultivating presence, kind of creating this sense of spaciousness and openness that now kind of relates to things going on in the macro and the micro. The fundamental problem today is feeling isolated and sort of disconnected, disempowered, kind of broken off from what's going on, or how to make sense of the world, and also to feel empowered to do anything about it. And I think this attitude of like, yeah, do it with, well, for you, it's writing. It's something you've always done. If you see it through that, you really see it through everything. And that's what we're really trying to do here. Is like, studying the structures is not just theoretical. It's like, okay, how do we understand our own humanity? And in the original sense of theorizing, right, which is like a whole transformation of perception, it's like when we work on that, then the sense-making crisis, I don't want to say it's solved necessarily, but as an individual, you don't necessarily feel broken off and disconnected anymore. You know, you have this empowerment now to do this and see it in other aspects of your life. And I think this is a really, as a gift that we can aspire to in these communities of practice and study in art. Ultimately, that's what we want. We want people to be able to kind of see it in themselves and everywhere, to release that dichotomy, right? So yeah. Matt's just saying I have to go. Yeah, Matt, hope you join us next week. We're going to have another one on, oh gosh, I forget the topic of it, but at the moment, but we're going to have another one next week. So definitely join us for that if you can. And thanks for joining us today. Really appreciated your comments. So yeah, I think this is a good place to pause as well. This feels like a right moment. So any other closing thoughts or reflections, or even suggestions for future topics?
I just love what you're doing here. So thank you.
Okay. Yeah, of course, Edith. Thank you. And thank you, Matt. Hope you guys have a great day, and be in touch. Send me a note anytime. Happy to hear it. And see you soon. Bye.